Hello and welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Power, standing in for the unwell spanners to take you through some 2025 what-if questions and also some big and possibly dirty news. But before all that, I'll have to remind you that we're an independent podcast produced in a podcasting shed with the kind support of our patrons and partners. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. Of course, we won't be alone on this journey of speculation as we are joined by two mighty fine human beings. In the co-host seat is everybody's favourite brass-fondling musician. It's Matt Trumpets. How's it going, Matt?
I gotta say, it's not a deflection, it's a rotation. And yes, I'm talking about the Flexi-wings, which hopefully we get to talk about later. Yay!
Ooh, and not a rotation of FIA stewards either.
Ooh, nice one, Kyle.
Nice. Yeah, I've been thinking about that one. We're also joined all the way from down under. Core blimey, was I? It's only Johnny Simon. How's it going, Johnny?
Yeah, good, Kyle. It's good to be back on. I can't believe it's already February. I missed an entire January of Missed Apex, but now we're back already. It's been a year since the Lewis Hamilton to Ferrari announcement, which I know you talked about in the last pod recently, but my word, it's been a year since that. I don't know, time is flying. It's kind of just hit me the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, same. It's absolutely crazy. The more I think about it, the more sort of excited I'm sort of getting for the season. But what I am also excited about is some potential what-if questions. So this is a what-if episode. So let's dive straight into it. And for our listeners, Johnny come up with a brilliant idea of let's pose a couple of hypothetical what-if situations and see what the consequences are. So we've got 5 questions to pose to the panel here and answer. So let's start off with the first one, and that is, what if McLaren produces a dominant car for 2025? Who's facing the bigger judgment year? Is it Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri? Now, Johnny, you've got some skin in this game. You've got a fellow countryman in there. What do you say?
First off, when you say brilliant idea, let's see how this plays out, because not all my ideas, work to the best. But it's actually a really good question, because I look into what happened last season and I go, hey, Lando Norris has had a chance to win a title. He's left a lot of F1 fans, or just people who watch the sport in general, disappointed by his performance. They wanted him to put up a great challenge in a Constructors' Championship winning car to Max Verstappen. And he kind of did, but didn't. And then you look at the points gap on paper and you go, he was way off. But then if you watch the season with 8 races to go, you say he was there, and it just becomes a bit of a shaky one. So if they have another dominant car this year, is he facing pressure? Is he facing judgment from fans? Will be scolded for producing a similar performance that he did in 2024? Or will his Australian teammate, Oscar Piastri, also face the same consequences? Can Piastri finish second to Norris this season? No. I wouldn't say that's going to ruin his career, but it could set the tone for the next 5 years of his career and how people think of Oscar Piastri. He needs to beat Norris this year. He can't be the next coming of Mark Webber, in a sense, as Mark Webber was to Sebastian Vettel, that number 2 driver. So I think, and this is where we could talk about this 5-10 minutes, which is what we're going to do, but it's who's facing the bigger judgment year out of those two. And it's a great question, because they're both kind of, I don't want to say on the chopping block, but they're kind of in that situation, Kyle, where it's like this could define their careers in a sense, 2025.
A little bit, but Matt, in my opinion, Norris is still the standard there at McLaren, and I think everyone expecting Norris to be on top of Piastri. My personal opinion is Piastri was a little bit lackluster last year.
It's hard to say lackluster, because obviously the thumb was placed on the scale mid-season to begin assisting Norris. But I think it's clear if you look at the performances, and particularly if you look at points scored, I'd argue next season is a bigger deal for Piastri. He's going to have to do better than 25% of the points if he wants people to take him seriously. He's had enough conditioning. He's made some improvements overall. But at the end of the day, if he doesn't improve relative to Norris significantly, I'd say, then he's much more, he's looking like someone to be traded away to another team for a future draft prospect.
Are you bringing basketball references in, Matt? Because I would be so excited to talk about what in the world was that Luka Doncic trade. Anyway, we won't get into that. I can't believe that made it to this pod. That's how big that news was. It's like Verstappen trading for Leclerc to team up with Hamilton at Ferrari. Insane stuff. Anyway, back to what you were talking about. Now, I know this isn't exactly what you said, Matt, but how many times have you heard a driver is in the best shape of their life over January? Like every driver just seems to be in the best shape of their life. Like Lewis Hamilton every year is like, oh, I've never felt fitter. This is amazing. And I'm like, well, you kind of said that 10 years ago. Like how much more fitter can you really be? But anyway, Jenson Button proved that you can be an Iron Man and still race F1 cars. You know, his fitness was immense. Point is now, for Norris himself, and this is where it becomes a little bit interesting with McLaren. Did they, I don't want to say like luck into a title. What I'm trying to say next is they had a great car, but was the reason they even won the Constructors title because of Sergio Perez? Like if Perez was on his game, do we even put any pressure on the McLaren duo at all? Do we put any pressure on the team to win a title? At the moment, they've kind of won a title, and I feel like their expectations have gone up because of it. But I kind of feel like they fell into the title because Sergio Perez was hopeless in the Red Bull.
For this, well, let's wind it back to the original question. Was Piastri good enough to enable them to get that title, or did you, like as you said, is that actually luck? Like I'd say Piastri was a pretty good number 2 in there, racked up a load of points. Perez was absolutely awful, but to say next year then, or this year even, I'm not used to 2025 yet, if Piastri puts in the same level of performance that he did relative to Norris, and Red Bull and Lawson is absolutely amazing, do you think McLaren would pull off a World Constructors Championship again?
You just, first off, you just said if Lawson is amazing, which I never want to hear ever again, because I don't think that's ever going to happen. But you that's a good point, because like I don't know, maybe I'll throw this one to Matt instead, because I do think the pressure is higher on McLaren, is what I was trying to say earlier anyway.
As a team, yeah, the pressure is very high on McLaren. And here's why. Last season, they purposefully delayed the introduction of their winning car long enough to take advantage of the wind tunnel and CFD rules. So essentially, they had, relative to Ferrari and Red Bull, extra development time all the way up to halfway through the season. And I believe that was an intentional decision. It was a strategic decision to implement their developments that way for that purpose. And they figured they could make enough on the back end for the losses on the front end. But this year, they go into the season, number 1. They have the least amount of testing time. So what we should see from them is the dominant car, similar to what we've seen from Red Bull in the past, because that is their only hope, because the other teams will be able to do more testing and catch up to them more rapidly. And there are other wrinkles to that, but that's why I think the start of the season is everything for McLaren. And if Piastri doesn't get off to a good start, he's very rapidly going to be relegated by the team if they sniff a driver's championship in addition to a constructor's championship.
Okay, then. So let's say that they do actually produce this car that we said. So if Piastri finishes behind Norris, which in my opinion, that's kind of expected, we want to see him very, very close. Surely McLaren, even if they demote him to a number 2, they're not going to want to get rid of him. Like, you know, what's the worst that could happen to Piastri here? He just gets locked into a bit of a journeyman number 2 role, Jono? Surely they won't look to get rid of him.
It pretty much is what's going to happen to Carlos Sainz. That seems like the trajectory at the moment that Piastri is going on. It's not a like for like, but it's kind of, you know, as close of a comparison I can make recently. When you look at, now I hate gambling in F1, but I like looking at the odds because I like to see what Vegas and everyone's saying. And Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, each tied to win the title, $3.25. I'm not going to go with American odds plus all that stuff. I don't care. I don't really know how to do that, but $3.25 is not such bad odds, I guess. Oscar Piastri at $8.75. So they think, the bookies think that Norris is going to beat Oscar Piastri this year. what I think, and it's interesting what Matt said, McLaren now have won the constructors. It's great for the team, great for their reputation. They're arguably going to have the best car. They're favourites to win the constructors this year, along for some reason with Ferrari, that they're up there. I don't know. Let's just wait for testing and see what Ferrari produce. But again, Piastri's career is slowly turning into a Carlos Sainz role, and he can't afford to have that. He needs to find a way to topple Norris this year. Piastri's only hope, I would say, is the transition we saw from Max Verstappen. Do you remember 2017 to 18, where he kind of was on the same level as Ricciardo, and everyone out there was at the same now? We're going, is Piastri better than Norris? Should he move aside? Same back then in Red Bull. And then came 2018 where Verstappen made that shift into the dominant driver. That's what we're looking for. Well, that's one of them, exactly. That's what we're looking for from Oscar Piastri in 2025, I would say. That's kind of the judgment we're going to make there. To answer the original question from 5 minutes ago, who's facing a bigger judgment year, I'd probably say it's got to be Lando Norris. If you've got a championship-winning car, you've got to win the driver's title this year.
I would agree with that. And as I said last week, I think Norris was actually a bit of a flannel last year and was a bit too soft in a lot of his fights with Verstappen, and also seemed a bit too ready to take the blame for things and take it on his shoulders. Matt, please disagree with us, or do you completely agree?
No, I don't agree with you at all. Because number one, there's no guarantee that what is a championship winning car at the start of the season will remain one across the whole of the season, with people's developments and bailing for 2026. And as far as things go, Norris's only problem is going to be if Piastri gets off to a lightning start and puts him under severe pressure. And honestly, and I mean no disrespect to Piastri, I'm not sure he's quite there. So the only problem Norris faces at McLaren is being worse than Piastri. And I think he's still got that covered.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm making sense, but for Piastri, he has to do better against Norris to show that he still has the potential to replace Norris or to be the lead driver in another competitive team where he can win a championship, which is his goal. If his goal is just to be in the sport, he's already done more than enough. He could stay there for 10 years and be happy in that role where I win when the number one driver has a problem. But that's not his goal. And Norris, all he has to do is just outscore him and be slightly better.
Okay, very quickly, John, and then come back to me to finish.
The one thing I'm going to say on this just quickly before we end is, do you remember when Piastri was told to move aside? It was mid-season and everybody was, well, I don't want to say everybody, but all the Aussies that I knew were kind of found it ridiculous that McLaren were asking Oscar to move aside for Lando Norris to win this title. And we were all having a huge debate that they should have even done it earlier, to give Norris more points. Now, in hindsight, looking back on it, I think it's a great thing that McLaren didn't ask Oscar to move aside early in those early races. And I know they did later on, because Lando had no chance of winning the title, and he proved that. Whether or not it was the car or whether it was him, that was reality. So I think that's kind of saved a bit of an ugly situation heading into 2025. It's kind of also saved Oscar in a sense, because he's kind of helped his teammate win a title. His teammate didn't really get the job done. Now he comes into 2025. I don't sit here going, Oscar's got to move out of the way in race one, race two. I don't see him like a Sergio Perez, a Mark Webber. I don't see him as that big number two like Red Bull used to have.
So you see him as number one. You think he's going to be this dominant number one potentially in the making?
I think 6 races in, if Oscar Piastri's 1 race ahead, I think we should be starting to talk about Lando Norris moving aside. I know it's early in the season, it's a long season, but there's a chance that quarter of the way through this year, if Oscar can build a good early advantage, let's back him for the title.
Okay, that's good. So basically you're saying unless Oscar Piastri beats Lando Norris this year, he's going to be Carlos Sainz.
That is a very good way to sum up our first what if. Yes.
Lovely. So that's a good what if. We have a nice juicy one. Let's move on from that now. I think we can all agree that Oscar Piastri is going to turn into Carlos Sainz. That's exactly what you two have said. No returnees. So let's go on to our second question, and that is, what if Red Bull produce a dog of a car and struggle in their first full year of being Adrian Newey-less? Does Max Verstappen leave, or does he ride it out with them? Matt Trumpets. Does Max leg it?
Max is not interested in anything but winning all the things. If he senses weakness at Red Bull, he will be looking for the exits as rapidly as possible, which brings up a sub what if. Will he tank to miss performance clauses on the Red Bull side so he can go wherever he wants immediately?
Oh, that's devious. Jono, surely you wouldn't put it past Max to tank or intentionally do bad to get himself out of a contract. Surely you wouldn't expect that of a Red Bull driver.
I heard a wrinkle of this, Matt. Can you clarify? Is this a definite thing that's in his contract? If he doesn't meet certain conditions, he can get out of his, or is this just like a speculation at the moment? Like, can he get out of his Red Bull deal if he doesn't meet certain clauses?
Of course, I'm sitting here with a copy of Max's contract right in front of me, Jono. No, I have no idea. I'm riffing on the fact that we've seen similar speculation about Sebastian Vettel and Ricciardo in the past and other drivers. Generally, I think it's a generally accepted thing that on both sides there are certain performance qualifiers, whether it's for bonuses or whether it's for the right to replace you, et cetera, and so on. But generally speaking, a driver like Max will probably have some kind of, well, if you give me a car that could only finish 8th in the World Constructors Championship, I'm within my rights to go negotiate a new deal, pay you some money, and be off skis. And it just occurred to me that if Red Bull don't sort their issues out, or they don't provide him with much improvement over last season, he will be looking for the exits. And if that clause exists in his contract, that's a very easy way for him to get what he wants.
Now, let's clarify. Verstappen's deal ends in 2028 from memory. I might have had that wrong, actually. No, it's 2028. I'm pretty sure it ends in a few years. Now, if you're going to talk with me for the rest of my life about Formula One, I don't believe in contracts. Like, this isn't the NBA. I know we're talking about Doncic and all that earlier.
That's twice now. 2 strikes.
That's twice. Oh, my goodness. It is. Can you believe it? Anyway, it's as big as Hamilton signing with Ferrari, I have to say. It's as big as that news, if not bigger. Point is, Max Verstappen's deal, it doesn't matter when it finishes, because all I know in F1 is that no matter what I've seen for a contract end date, half the contracts don't even reach that point. They just like get out of them, buyouts, all this kind of stuff. Now, in terms of does Max leave, do we put like a bet that midway through this season he'll sign elsewhere? Does he do a Fernando Alonso-esque like sign with, I don't know, Ferrari for 2027, but it's the end of 2025?
Be like a pre-agreement thing.
Yeah, and then has to drive a full miserable 2026 season with Red Bull. Does he stick around for Red Bull's 2026 car? I think that would be the most logical thing to do. This is, even if Red Bull have a dog of a car, as you're saying, Kyle, what if they do this year? And what if Max leaves because of it? I think he has to test the waters in 2026. I think you got to play the safer option. You can't do this Fernando Alonso, just jump around to any team because I've alienated everyone in my career. You've got to test the waters of 2026. If there's no potential under the new rules and the new regulations, then you start looking. I think if it gets to February testing in 12 months' time and the car for next season's no good, bang, I would start getting my phone ready, get your agent around you, whoever his agent is, probably his dad, and just try and sort everything out.
There's one other aspect to this, which we're not really considering as well with him staying at Red Bull, and that is, you just mentioned, his father and his relationship with Christian Horner. That, if you believe what most things you've been reading in the press, it's not exactly a picnic within Red Bull at the moment between them two, and the Verstappens are very much aligned with Helmut Marko. And Verstappen's always said, I'm going with Helmut, pretty much. So I think maybe one of the wider questions is, will Helmut Marko, would the Verstappen, does that whole team want to leave Red Bull and get out if Christian Horner's there? So I personally, to put my 2 cents into here, I think if the car's a dog, Max will be looking to get out and will try to get out by mid-season. I think he'll just not be interested in it and will just want to try and break out and get himself elsewhere.
And Matt, just quickly, Red Bull have never in their history been without Adrian Newey for a full season. This is the first time we're going to experience this. It got ugly when he left the team in May last year. Straight away, the car was never good for the rest of the year, in a sense. I mean, it kind of came together, I don't know how, at the end of the year. So this is a big judgment day for them, or judgment year.
it is a big judgment year for them as a team. And certainly Newey's comments in the press have reflected his opinion that, it was mostly lack of experience as to why they wandered off the correct path. And who knows, he might actually be right about it. But if we're going to talk about what happens if their car is no better than we saw in the doldrums, because they did make some improvements. Like, my personal sense is that it won't be the world beater it was, but it's probably going to be closer to what we saw towards the end of the season. There'll be circuit specificity, and there'll be times where it really works the way it's supposed to. But if you're making a bet on 2026, you've got to really bet on the powertrain. And this is what I think will be telling a story that nobody is aware of. Because if there's anyone that knows how the powertrain development is going to be going at Ford Red Bull powertrains, a brand new power unit entry for 26, it's probably going to be Verstappen. They'll have a lot of access to how that development is going. But you know what? If I want Max to drive for me, guess who else is going to know a lot about where that engine is? So if I'm looking around in 26, Honda, Mercedes, maybe Ferrari, those are what I would consider your safest bets.
And also, I saw an article during the week, Kyle, where it said Ford is already working with Red Bull powertrains on 2026. I hope to God they're working with Red Bull by this time for 2026. What article? Did I read that properly? Like, they were already creating components together, and I'm like, this is like, why am I just hearing about this now? I should have heard about this 15,000 years ago. Like, this is insane. So what if they're behind the curve for next year, which would be pretty funny?
Maybe. And yeah, like I said, the Verstappens will be the people who will have that information, and I'm sure they will have the information. And that leads us beautifully on to our third question in this hypothetical universe we're living in right now. So what if Max actually does leave? Midway through next year, he's had enough. The Verstappens pulled the plug on the whole Red Bull relationship. It goes down the pan. Max does leave. What are the consequences? So what if Max leaves? Are George Russell and Kimi Antonelli now driving for their futures, looking over their shoulders? Do McLaren jump and dump their Norris or their new now Carlos Sainz Piastri for Max? And what about Aston Martin and Honda? Will they get rid of the some would say the Nepo baby in Lance and their son, and pair Max with the mighty Alonso? Jono first and then Matt.
So I put this in, and it's kind of old news because this has been talked about for a few months, that this season in 2025 is kind of a job interview for George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, kind of a job interview to keep their current jobs in a sense, because they're both driving at Mercedes this year. And the reason is, if Max leaves, and he doesn't leave Formula One entirely, because that's also up in the air, he might do a Kimi Räikkönen, drive in 7 different categories around the world, then come back to Formula One. That's a possibility, right? But let's say he just moves teams in F1, gives it another shot. George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, there's going to be a spot at Mercedes. And if I'm Toto Wolff, if I'm any team owner out there, you'd be silly not to even open a discussion with Max Verstappen. Even if you're Haas, even if you're Visa, or you can't if you Cash App RB, because it makes no sense, obviously. But if you're most of the other teams down the grid, you have to open up the conversation. So then, Matt, that puts George Russell and Kimi Antonelli's futures at Mercedes in limbo, because Verstappen will take a spot there. Now, if he doesn't go to Mercedes and McLaren start opening the door for Verstappen, do they dump Norris or Piastri? Which brings the question, this is a big judgment year for Norris or Piastri, because if you have a good 2025, you probably don't want to dump that driver in your lineup.
Right. So I want to be very clear about this. If Max does leave, I believe it's because the powertrain is going to be a disaster. It has less to do with the aerodynamics. And I believe that the team he goes to will be the team he thinks has the best engine for 2026. I realize I didn't make that clear for everyone, even though in my mind that circle was closed.
Who's that going to be, Matt?
Oh, well, we shall have to find out. But let's engage in endless speculation. Last time we had an engine reset, it was Mercedes that knocked it out of the park, sank the three-pointer at the buzzer, if you will. And I think if he goes to Mercedes, I don't think Antonelli has any issues at all. Mercedes are keeping Antonelli. It's Russell who is absolutely fighting for his life in that scenario, because Russell is good, but Max has how many championships? Okay, yeah, there you go. I think it's a no-brainer. Mercedes always wanted Verstappen. Let's not forget, as a junior, the only reason Red Bull were able to snitch him is they offered to put him in a car immediately, and Mercedes told him he had to wait. So if he could get into a Mercedes and he's convinced they have the best engine, I think no matter how well Russell does this season, he's gone.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, because, well, as we've seen a lot, we have seen an awful lot that, Toto has been laying out the roses on the bed. He's put fresh bed sheets on. He's got the candles lit. He is ready for a romantic date with Verstappen. He has been courting the Verstappens. He's been saying all sorts of lovely things and trying to desperately get them into his team. What does that say about his commitment to George Russell, and then putting Kimi in the team as well? I think even if Kimi Antonelli has a rough, crashy season next season, he would still ditch George for Max, because he's looking at Kimi as the future, and he desperately wants Max. Like, Jono, would you not do the same? That seems fairly logical to me.
If you're 6 months into a rookie campaign and he's been crashing a lot and he still picks Kimi Antonelli, my head would explode. You've got a proven amazing driver in George Russell. George Russell has come in, and I know Lewis Hamilton's like 500 years old now, but he came and beat him he's been doing pretty well against Lewis Hamilton, right? Like, why would you dump that? You've got something there. You've got something proven. You're now going to take on Verstappen, which is proven, obviously, but then you're going to pair him with an unknown. I just think you've got to keep George, and you'd be silly not to, regardless of what happens 6 months into the year. Now, this is what the problem is for Mercedes, is secretly, you wouldn't want Max to struggle this year. You wouldn't want that relationship to go sour, because I would want to have just a little bit more time, like a full season under Kimi Antonelli's belt, before then Verstappen comes calling in February next year and goes, hey, I want to come sign in Mercedes. Now I've got a full year to make a decision. I go, well, George was good, but Kimi's better, so I'm going to choose Kimi. Does that make sense? Whereas if Max starts getting disgruntled in May and I'm Toto Wolff, I go, I know I want Max, but now how do I make a decision for these other two? That's the problem there.
You're not going to ditch your young protege, though, that you've taken a risk to put on there. So what happens to Kimi then? Surely another team would swoop in and try to nick Kimi, which he wants to kind of protect.
Hasn't Antonelli lasted like 2 laps in an F1 car, from what I've seen in public?
But no, the data was amazing. Remember what Toto said?
Yeah.
The lap up to that point was incredible, just like Max Verstappen's 2021 Jeddah lap. It was amazing up until the point where it wasn't.
Well, that's the thing. I think you could be forgiven if you're Mercedes. If you sign Verstappen and then you get George Russell, he's your number 2 in a sense, right? Because he has to be. Verstappen's just the greatest driver on the grid. Now, you'd be mistaken and forgiven for giving up Kimi Antonelli, because you've got possibly one of the greatest driver on the grid. Who cares if you give up the next greatest driver on the grid? You've got the other one. Whereas if you gave up, for example, I don't know, if you gave up Kimi Antonelli for Charles Leclerc, then I'd be like, no, I'd rather keep Kimi and take a risk there. Do you see what I'm saying here? I know I'm kind of going a bit off topic, but then it's like for Russell and Antonelli this year, going back to the main topic, they have to be on it by race 1, because there's a chance by April, May, Verstappen's unhappy and he starts talking to Mercedes, and one of them's on the chopping block.
Okay, so what's your answer then? Who would you? So you're saying you'd dump Kimi, because you've got to think Verstappen. Verstappen comes up, you're Toto. Verstappen comes asking, you're taking him regardless, and then you're going to deal with the consequences afterwards. I think that's logical fact. So it's a question of who you're dumping, George or Kimi.
Man, that's a good question. I don't like.
It's a very simple and easy to answer question for me.
One or the other.
You dump George Russell. Wow.
Right. So John.
Yeah.
You saying you'd dump George Russell, or you'd dump
right
Kimi?
now? I would because it's a fun podcast and I hate sitting on the fence. I have to dump George Russell. I can't believe I just said that. You'd have to dump George.
You'd dump George. Trumpets. Who would you dump before we move on?
For a variety of reasons. and a lot of them have to do with Max in a team, you'd have to get rid of Russell. I mean, oil, water, sodium, water, I don't know, pick your favorite combination of things that go boom. Right away, you'd have a massive problem and fight between the two of them. It's been demonstrated Max works very well with a teammate who can be mostly as good as him some of the time, but maybe not so much with a teammate who can actually be as good as him more of the time. So you'd want to avoid that personality conflict. But mostly with Antonelli, you've just got a rookie who's going to learn tons from Max and is already, according to your own telemetry and judgment, super duper fast. Why would you not want that? I don't understand it. We saw Max practically win a championship by himself in a Red Bull. So you're not worried about that. He's an amazing driver in that sense. Yeah, no, Antonelli would be clearly a much more logical choice for all of the above reasons.
Okay. Oh my God, what's that coming over hill? Is that a whole panel in unanimous agreement that we'd dump George Russell? Yes, it is. And I think it's a good point to move on to the very next point that we have, our fourth question in this series of what ifs. Now, we are conscious that we did speak a bit about Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari last week, so this is a slightly different play on this question. What if Leclerc beats Hamilton at Ferrari? Will Lewis play a good number two? And will he stick around to see his contract? So we're putting this in as if it's a landslide. If Leclerc spanks Hamilton at Ferrari next year, does Lewis drop his head? Does he play? And will he be willing to play a nice number two? And will he see out his contract? Jono?
I think he definitely sees out his contract. I think it would be a tragic end to an awesome career if it came to December this year and he'd all of a sudden bowed out of Formula One and that was it. So I think regardless of what the result is this year, I think he sticks around for 2026. See how it all goes with the new car. Now, you kind of spoke about it, like you said in the last pod, but for Lewis Hamilton, like there's no guarantee, and we talked about this, that if Ferrari produced that championship-winning car this year, who's to say that he's even going to win the title? Because Charles Leclerc's a pretty good driver. We haven't seen them head-to-head in the same machinery before. It all comes into a bit of an unknown. I think 100%, Matt, he sees out his contract. He has to test the waters in 2026, sees how the new cars are, then makes a decision on his career. I know some people think this is like the farewell tour for him. I think if he wins the 8th title, I think we'll see the end of Lewis Hamilton. But it's the modern day. Like Fernando Alonso was supposed to retire 6 years ago and he's still hanging around. Who's to say Hamilton doesn't stick around for 2027 and 2028? So it's a big what if.
Yeah, I agree with you. So to me, the way to answer this question is to ask myself, under what circumstances could I see that happening? Because I agree with you. Under most circumstances, what you're going to get from Hamilton and Hamilton's camp is, well, it's an adjustment year, blah, blah, blah. Let's see what happens in 2026. I'm getting used to the new team. Leclerc's been bedded in. He's been their primary driver since they decided to drop Vettel back in how many years ago? Right. So you could easily see that being a response and Hamilton sticking around for 26 to see if the car suits him better, which it might very well. However, in the event, it's the kind of, if he puts in a Perez-like performance against Leclerc, because we're talking a spanking here. You talked about spanking. You raised my expectations here, Kyle.
That's true. I said spanking, not comprehensive spanking.
Okay, well, maybe I'm getting a little over my skis with that one. But what I would say is I do think there's maybe a non-zero probability if he's losing like that badly, that he convinces himself that, you know what, actually, maybe it's gone. Maybe the magic has left me. And maybe it's better to admit that and move on with my life, rather than continue to occupy this valuable real estate. Now, if you ask me how much of a probability, I'm going to have a whole bunch of zeros attached to the right side of a decimal point with a percent sign. I don't think it's very, very likely at all. But I do think there might be a combination of circumstances where he might decide that, oh, you know what, like if he thinks he doesn't have it in him to compete with Leclerc anymore, legitimately by looking at the telemetry and everything else, then yeah, he might decide to make it a swan song this season.
Yeah, that's my concern, that he drops his head down a little bit and it gets to him. Now, going into our Patreon live chat on Discord, we've ended up in the FIA naughty books. Paddy says, spanking to MBS prison you go. So let's watch our language, and I'm taking no responsibility as the host at all. That's clearly on the panelists being unruly. So do we all think, I think Hamilton will be a good boy. He will fulfill his contract, and I think he will play a number 2. Happy, Johnny? Like, do you think he's a very honourable and professional guy? I think if he's asked to, he will play a number 2 if he needs to.
You put it in perfect words, honourable and professional. He's always done that, even as the number 1. You know, when he moved aside for Valtteri Bottas at Hungary, obviously Valtteri moved aside for him, but he moved aside back, which is what not many people have done in recent years of Formula One, watching it in my lifetime at least. So he's always been a good teammate, I think is the right way to put it. And I think if it does come to a situation this year that the car is good and Charles Leclerc's on his way to his first world title, Lewis Hamilton may play a good number 2. Doesn't mean to say that Lewis Hamilton's career is done or anything like that. We could have a situation where, you know, we had Senna and Prost, excuse me. I got a bit confused there for Jesus Christ. But we had them, you know, every year. You didn't know who was going to win the title, who's best. Now, it didn't mean any of them were bad. It just mean 2025 was this man's year. 2026 could be this other man's year. So we could have that situation going on. It could be 2007 Kimi Räikkönen wins the title, and then next year Felipe Massa's on for it, even though he didn't win it. But you know what I mean there.
Okay, so that's fair enough. I think that's a good place to leave that point now. I think we're all in agreement that yeah, it's a very real possibility Lewis is going to be beaten by Leclerc next year, and none of us don't think he'll spit the dummy and leave and say it's his ball and is going home. So that leads us on to our final question of this what if segment. And well, it wouldn't be a podcast with Matt Trumpets on it if he didn't have a chance to speak about his favourite driver. So he's managed to somehow sneakily shoehorn a Haas question into here. So it is, what if Haas don't improve with this uplift in budget and tech support from Toyota? Who gets thrown under the bus? Is there more pressure on Ocon or the debutant Behrman? Matt first, because this is your favorite chap, isn't it?
It is, for a lot of different reasons. Mainly, I feel like he never quite got the fair shake he deserved based on his abilities. But that's just me. You don't have to agree with that. What makes this interesting is Haas have suddenly a whole new suite of tools. They have the simulator, they have the Toyota budget, they're able to test previous cars for the first time in their entire history as a manufacturer, and as a team in Formula One. Sorry, they're not a manufacturer. As a team in Formula One, they've never had that before. And look at where they finished last year without it. So it's very much going to be on Komatsu and the rest of the team to make hay while this sun shines. Because how long Toyota, famous for sticking around forever in Formula One when things don't go their way, how long are they really going to stick around if this partnership goes backwards? To me, that obviously, if they go forwards, you could see them finishing 6th, maybe even if Aston does nothing next season as predicted, maybe 5th. But what happens if it all goes sideways on them? Who gets thrown under the bus? Now, for me, you got to look at the team principal at that point. But that's just for starters.
Who gets thrown under the bus, John 8?
Kyle, I dozed off for a second there, talking about Haas for 2 minutes. Oh, yeah. I don't think I can take any more. No. In all seriousness, Matt's got a great point, and they come into a season where it kind of is interesting now, because the 5th spot was, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought should be locked up by Aston Martin every year with the situation they've got going on.
That's fair.
And I kind of go into 2025 going, well, I don't know. Is this Haas's time to shine? Because Williams have a very promising lineup. We'll try and get into that before the end of the show if we have time. But you've got 2 veteran drivers. You're finally not going the traditional, like, kind of pay driver route. I know, like, everyone's kind of a pay driver in a sense and blah, blah, blah. But you get what I'm trying to say there. You've got Sainz and Albon, that could really propel them up the standings. I don't think Hadjar and Tsunoda, I think Hadjar is going to be a weakness in scoring points for them. So it opens the door now for Haas to move up the order. This is promising. This is a post-Gunther Steiner era. Not to hang this on him, but I kind of was sitting in 2020 going, well, this guy's pretty famous at, on Drive to Survive, and he's great at marketing your team. He can be the face of your team. I think if the team principal is the face of your team, you've got a big problem. I think now, Ocon and Behrman, they're not going to be the future of your team there, but that's a very solid lineup to score some good points. But now this is a big door, like Matt said. He's shown all the possibilities going into this year. They have to take advantage of claiming that 5th spot. I think this is the time. I'm buying a little bit of Haas stock. I'm not completely sold on it. I want to obviously see what happens in testing, because you never know. Sometimes in testing, a team will show up and then they'll open DRS and they're the quickest car, and then it throws you off going into round 1 because you don't know if that lap is actually legit. But let's see what happens over the next 12 months.
So with Haas then, we're expecting them to be much better. They've got this Toyota partnership. They can run a driver in loop simulator. They have 2 solid drivers. Now, Behrman, albeit we mentioned this last week as well, what defines a rookie really is a rookie in the sense of the word. Ocon is a known quantity. I'm going to offend Matt here and say he's a good journeyman of Formula One. I don't think he'll ever be a championship winner, but he's a good known quantity, and he is a Grand Prix winner. So you can't really blame the drivers. So if it doesn't happen, then surely you have to look at the management. And yeah, the current team principal is so much better than Steiner. I thought Steiner was a bit of a meme manager, really. He comes in and encourages his staff to say fluff or butter and to swear and to say all the naughty words, and that's what got him famous. So it seems like a much better environment there now it's gone. So I'm saying if it doesn't happen, then you can't blame the drivers. You have to blame their organisation as a whole. But what's the worst thing you can do when an organisation is struggling? It's do the Ferrari guillotine and sack all of your management. I think Haas are in a good place, and it sounds like it's going to be really good next year. So, Matt, what would you be happy with from your boy Ocon? Would you be happy with the odd podium and him thoroughly beating Behrman? Or would you just be happy just to see Haas up there in that P5 position, regardless of where Ocon finishes?
I think from a team point of view, P5 is an aspiration, P6 is a necessity, because they basically all but managed it. And the only reason they didn't, I will remind everybody right now, because it's one of my favorite things about last season, is because Ocon managed to pull off a P2 finish in that wet race in Brazil, along with Gasly directly behind him. Minus that, they were already P6. That's why I say Aston has to really be their aspirational target here. For Ocon, the thing that interests me most is how he adapts to the Ferrari power unit in terms of his driving. He's always been extremely good with tires. He's always been able to run super long stints. And he's never driven a Ferrari power unit. He's driven a Mercedes power unit. He's driven a Renault power unit. He will be potentially the next Carlos Sainz here if he can get on top of that and manufacture some good points and results. The other thing to understand is that Haas has also updated their strategy group too. So potentially there will be those marginal points they left on the table, possibly more available to them. But having said that, I think the pressure is fully on Ocon, because everyone expects results from him, whereas Behrman
100%.
is just a rookie.
100%. And just to add one quick thing to that is Behrman has like that lineup there. I know this sounds surprising, but it has a chance to get dirty. Like if Behrman starts having Ocon in the first few races, you could see a very disgruntled Frenchman.
We have seen this before, haven't we? We have seen Ocon getting extremely fighty with his teammates. Behrman, he's proven himself already in the couple of sort of rounds that he has done already. He's been immediately quick and on the pace and quite solid. So I do think Ocon's going to have his hands full. Now, personally, I think I've had my hands full of all of that speculation. That was an awful lot of speculation. So I think it might be time for some big dirty news.
Big dirty news.
Lovely. We have a few quite big news topics to talk about here. It's been quite a good week for news in Formula One, actually. So the first one, which only dropped a couple of days ago, which I find quite amazing, is the FIA has appeared to done a complete U-turn and reneged on what they said about the Flexi-wing debate. So they're going to clamp down on the F1 wing flexing after previously, last season, saying that they were going to allow it. And now they say that they're going to basically increase the test, which has infuriated a lot of the teams, Matt.
Well, yeah, and rightfully so. In fact, this might become the defining moment of next season's championship, because you have right now a passel of teams who have developed to the previous standard. So understand clearly that what we're talking about here is a static load test. And essentially the FIA is changing the testing to reduce by approximately 30% what they call deflection, although online tech people are saying it's more of a rotation. I don't even really want to get into that myself, but they're going to reduce the amount they're allowing 30%. So if you've developed this wing because you were promised by the FIA that this would be the standard for the upcoming season, you have spent a lot of money and a lot of resource developing not just the wing, but the underfloor and the floor edge to go along with how this wing behaves at both high and low speed. Now, the FIA, having been lobbied by certain teams, has said, oh, well, maybe you have a point. Maybe everybody can afford to do that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to give you half a season and then we're going to change it, which is the most expensive way to do this. So it's already mental. They could have just said, we'll change it for next season, right, and everyone would have been okay with it. They could have said it's going to be the same for next season. People might have been unhappy because they couldn't afford it, but at least it would have been the same standard for everybody. Now you've got some teams who maybe said we can't afford it, and they've developed a car that will be great the second half of the season, but not competitive at all the first half, and vice versa. If I've got a car fully developed for this flexi wing and I have to change the standard halfway through, I'm changing like a massive amount of my car potentially to stay competitive in a season when I wanted to be all done with my development before I even put a car on track, because I want to be concerned about 2026 instead.
So to sum up, it's expensive for the teams now because they originally said, is this going to just stop? Is this going to be allowed? Do we need to develop this? The FIA originally said, no, like you're allowed to do it, just develop this way. So then all the other teams are right, okay, we need to develop these flexi wings. Now they've come out and said at the last minute, once the teams have already spent loads of money developing them, and said, oh, no, actually, now you're not allowed. So, Jono, that's a bit off, isn't it?
Which is why it's kind of separated into, you've got your static deflection tests, which will take place in about, I don't know, is round one in 6 weeks? Can you believe it's already like that quick, which is amazing. So there'll be tests in round one in Australia, and then when we get to the Spanish Grand Prix later on, they'll introduce kind of additional tests as well. So it gives the teams time to adapt. But like Matt said, I don't want to be focusing on my front wing heading into the Spanish Grand Prix. I want to be thinking 2026. If it gets to the Spanish Grand Prix time and you're sitting in May and you go, my car is awful this year, it drives like a Ford Laser, then you may as well just focus on 2026. And so you don't want to be adjusting your front wing and wasting resources and time on that. Now, which team? Now, I think this is the question, kind of what every F1 fan wants to know in sort of layman's terms. Who's this going to affect? It has to be McLaren the most, right? Like, they were the team that were highlighted to have the flexiest of flexi wings and mastered it. So now with so much reliability, I know that's sort of a poor word, but with so much sort of they depend so much on that front wing, that if you're now having to change that could then change the whole dynamics of how your car works. And you're already like heading into round one in 5-6 weeks.
I think it actually hurts anybody equally who is committed to this. So like Ferrari, for instance, at the back end of last year, said, do we need to make a flexi wing now? Is this going to be allowed? If I was like, yep, allowed. So they piled a load of money into it, made the wing, and now they're going to have to pretty much go back on it. So all during the off-season, it's my understanding that teams have been developing in this direction, Matt, saying like we're allowed to do this. And now they're probably going to get to the Spanish Grand Prix when I think from the static load test, they're allowed 15 millimeters deflection as it is, and that's going to be reduced to 10. And of course, Formula One is made by fine margins. A millimeter is huge. So 5 millimeters difference in a deflection test is massive. So they're going to have to then, I think some teams might be in the point of just literally strapping extra bits or bonding extra bits of carbon fiber onto the wings to stiffen them up. But all of this has been meticulously designed through CFD and like computational modeling, which they are limited on the amount of hours they're allowed to put in as well. So, Matt, surely this is just going to hurt everyone equally.
Yeah, it'll hurt everyone who embarked upon this path. Having been promised by the FIA, this would be the regulation for the entirety of the season. And I'm glad you bring up Ferrari, because both Ferrari and Red Bull had a lot of complaints about the wing pioneered by McLaren and also by Mercedes that used this principle, this sort of rotation deflection principle, to allow them to have better low speed front end downforce and reduce high speed turn end downforce, because what they were finding was that a wing that worked well at low speeds was putting too much balance forward and the drivers were losing the rear. Stop me if this sounds like your driver and team. And they waited 3 or 4 months, did Ferrari and Red Bull, for an answer from the FIA. Now, what I will point out here is Ferrari finished how many points behind McLaren exactly? They did not follow this Flexi-wing path until they were given the go-ahead from the FIA. They lost 3 or 4 months worth of points from following that path sooner, because they didn't want to spend the money unless they had to. And then they were told they could spend the money. It's all okay. They've spent the money. They have a whole car potentially designed around this. And now they said, well, only for half a season. So now you have to spend a whole bunch of extra money to undesign it for these new standards we're bringing in halfway through this season. It's just, I'm trying to be calm here, but oh my goodness, there are a lot of words that I'm not using right now.
I'm sure a lot of the team bosses, teams, and most workers in Formula One feel that against Mohammed Ben Sulayem, because we spoke last week on this seems sort of draconian sort of swearing laws that he's put in. He's hardly endeared himself to the whole of Formula One. And now this has now come out. I mean, surely he's now about as popular as an outbreak of syphilis in the pit lane. Like, this guy cannot be very popular coming in. It seems like he's on a path just to alienate himself from the rest of the teams, which I find absolutely incredible. But moving on to our next news topic, I don't think my panel have anything else to come back on that one. We've pretty much covered it. The next news topic I want to move on and talk about is Johnny Herbert has been dropped as a steward. So I think it depends which camp you sit in really on this. And I think there'll be quite a lot of people who are quite happy that Herbert has been dropped as a steward. And now it's my understanding, I'm hoping maybe the guys can clarify a bit more, but Johnny Herbert was an FIA steward. He was a steward in the very contentious Mexican Grand Prix last year, where Verstappen got penalised for some of his moves. But then also Johnny Herbert is also a pundit for some betting sites. So he's a steward, but then will also go and give his opinions. And he was quite outspoken after that Mexican Grand Prix about Verstappen's behaviour. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. And he's essentially been sacked, Jono. Like, do you think this is a fair and a good sacking?
I wasn't expecting that question. That's a good one, because that's what I think. Let's talk about that and let's figure out an answer in the next 5 minutes. The only reason this has really made the news is because it's Johnny Herbert. Like, stewards, who cares? But it's Johnny Herbert, which is why we really care, because there's been a lot of drama. Obviously, like you said, after Mexico and those were massive. Those were draconian penalties to Verstappen, but he was there to prove a point to Max. They were very personal penalties, but they weren't wrong.
That's
and
the word.
It created
personal.
a lot of drama. It was personal.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Now, back to the original topic, is the FIA's dumped him, all this kind of stuff. There has to be some word from behind the scenes or some pressure already lingering over his head after Mexico and what's happened over the past year. He's been a previous TV pundit. I kind of don't know what's left for Johnny Herbert now. He's had a miserable couple of years, dumped by Sky F1. He's now can't be a steward anymore. He's got to find some other means of getting pocket money. Does he go full betting route now? Does he just go straight into there? Well, I can't steward. I might as well just go in and just double down on this betting thing and start talking a little bit more about that. I think it's ridiculous. I'll let Matt talk, and then because I've been talking for ages, but man, I've got some opinions on this.
So my opinions will probably surprise some people and not surprise some other people, because if you're not right, you're wrong, basically. And for Herbert as a person, was not my favorite pundit, but the thing that I always felt he did bring to his job when he was on Sky was a very good and accurate moral clarity, where you would see lots of people being very wibbly wobbly about, oh, this or that or the other. He would just flat out say, no, that's actually wrong. It's kind of horrible. And I always appreciated that. And what I want to be clear about is I don't think he's being sacked for the job he did as a steward. And personally, I think he probably did a pretty good job. He's a former driver. He knows driving standards. And he himself suffered a fairly horrifying accident that I think made him correctly appreciative of protecting safety of the safety of the drivers. So in that sense, I think he was a good addition. The problem is, having been dropped from Sky, he began working as a pundit for betting sites. Now, working as a pundit, I have less issue with. You're simply revealing what everybody knows all stewards have, which is they have their favorites and they have their not so favorites. Every judge has this. It's not that you have them. It's that when I am a steward, I agree to leave that behind and simply judge the incidents on the merits as I see fit. And the issue for him was, one, he expressed those biases correctly. But I think the bigger issue really for him is he's being a pundit for betting sites. And that might just have been a bridge too far for the FIA.
Now, that is a semi-fair argument, but we've had a few people in our live chat here point out, one of them may or may not be quite ill at the moment, has pointed out that is he just been sacked because he has maybe annoyed Max and is being quite outspoken against Max and Red Bull. We know what happens to people who are outspoken against Max and Red Bull. So on the other side of that argument, there's also, if you're talking about conflicts of interest and making it personal, there's another steward which has quite personal ties to some Red Bull in Derek Warwick and is proved might have some personal issues there, which if you're playing devil's advocate, you could say that. But on the other hand, just to provide some balance here so we don't get slaughtered by the entirety of the Netherlands in the comments, there was also Fitzantonio Luizzi, who used to be a Red Bull driver on the stewards, who has always been a really fair and really good steward. So it's hard to say if there's personal things there. But Jono, I think that's probably fair. You can't really be a pundit and be quite outspoken against a certain driver and then be a steward at the same time. I think if you're a steward, you have to keep your personal views to yourself, really, I think.
No, I understand this. It's just funny that it's Johnny Herbert, which it's the only name that would cause so much controversy for being dropped as a steward after what happened this year. He was dumped from Sky in 2022, just to clarify that, end of 2022. So he wasn't on the Sky coverage from 2023. That's given you the full 23 and 24 seasons. That's 2 full years. Were the FIA just made aware of this now? Because as far as I'm aware, he's been doing the gambling punditry thing for a while now. It's not like he just started last week and has had to give up his role as steward.
Oh, so it's not new.
It's not new. So, well, as far as I'm aware, it's not new. I don't know when exactly he started. I heard, I might be wrong, but I read that he'd started right after he'd finished from Sky. Not that I go on these gambling sites, as I mentioned earlier, just to look at the odds. But
just to read the articles, okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, going back to what I was saying before, if you go with he's dumped in so when was it, 2022? I'm just trying to think about where I was up to here. Oh, that's what I was up to. He had 2 seasons. He's dumped now as a steward. Is this the FIA clamping down on things? Is this Mohammed Ben Sulayem going, okay, we've only just been made aware of this? Like, did they not know about this last year? That could be the case too. So I want to have the anti-argument for the people going, well, he's only been dumped because of the Max stuff. that link could be made, but it could also be that the FIA are just clamping down on things as they have been recently and only just found this out. So there is that possibility.
Yeah, and you still have the larger issue, which I find to be more problematic, is that stewards aren't paid for this. So if you're someone who needs to make money and there's a conflict and you make a decision somebody doesn't like, well, then you're incredibly vulnerable to being essentially wiped out as a steward, because this connection can be made. Whereas if you have enough money to be able to afford to be a steward for no money, and you don't have to do anything that involves you expressing your opinion outside of being a steward, well, then you can make any decisions you want and you're safe. It's the original model of Formula One being a sport for rich people. That is the structure of that still pervades to the sport to this day. And as it becomes more professionalized, it's increasingly a problem that needs to be addressed.
And Paddy in the live chats just confirmed that Johnny Herbert's been doing this since at least 2017 by the evidence Paddy's produced. So this is then, in my opinion, more of a fault on the FIA's end. You should have better kind of screening. What do you call it when you hire someone and you kind of screen them?
Vetting.
Like if somebody's, you vet them better. Like if you're going to bring someone in as a steward, look into their background. You're an organization. All I hear from this news is, and this is where I might be in a lonely island saying this just to end this topic, but as much as this is about the Max Verstappen stuff and Johnny Herbert sort of making that personal and the penalties there to teach him a lesson, as much as it is about Herbert being dropped as a steward, I think what comes out to me the most to this topic is how much credibility I think the FIA is losing and has lost recently.
Yep.
Because this should never have been an issue in the first place.
I think that's a very fair point and a fair way to end that topic. Now, we'll close on one last topic, a very small issue that we can just touch on, and that was Lewis Hamilton binning his SF23 on his second day testing in Barcelona. So there was testing under the testing previous cars. Sort of rules. It was an SF23. I think he got most of the day in on the Tuesday. I think it was a Wednesday morning. He binned it around about 11 a.m. at turn 12, very fast corner, did some damage. That curtailed any running that Charles Leclerc was going to have a chance in it. And then on the Thursday, they put Giovinazzi, yawn, and Dino Beganovic in to get his super license points. So why they're putting Speedy Jesus and Gio in, I do not know, but I guess they want some validating in, and he is their actual reserve driver. But if F1 drivers came in vanilla flavors, that would be it in my opinion. So Matt, I think this has been blown out of proportion a little bit. Like, yeah, people crash in testing and stuff, but obviously because it's Lewis Hamilton, it's made quite big news, and it's not a fantastic start, is it really?
Au contraire, my friend across the pond. I choose to apply my Fernando Alonso filter and say that there has never been a more committed testing lap driven than the one that saw Lewis Hamilton hit the wall.
Oh, that was the best testing crash ever. Like, that was the best one.
So there.
Well, it did Kimi Antonelli proud when he crashed it. Maybe the data was good until he crashed.
Best lap ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, here's a couple of things that's important to remember. First of all, it was the SF23, which was a particularly not great car. It was in Barcelona in the winter. And like, do we know the temperature or track condition? I thought it was damp or wet, maybe. Like it's not a real surprise if you're trying to find the limit of a car rapidly that you would lose control of it in the wet, especially. But even still, it's really, honestly, it's a nothing burger. This wasn't like a full speed smash disaster crash with everything destroyed. This was I lost it and dinked the nose and they had to replace it. And that's all it was.
And you can't, like, I think if this happened to any other driver, I don't think we would even hear it in the news. Maybe I'm wrong. Like
Yeah, that's a good
sometimes
point.
you do hear test accidents come out because it's Hamilton in Ferrari. It's his opening month with the team. It's a big story because it's Johnny Herbert getting sacked. It's a massive story. So whenever something jumps out at you and is going to capture headlines, you publish it. Now, it was, by the way, funny you mentioned Speedy Jesus before. I haven't heard that nickname in a while. That is one of the best things. I can't believe he's back. I didn't even realize he still existed. We're talking about Antonio Giovinazzi here. But there was a stat that came out. I don't know if any of you saw. Lewis Hamilton, every time he crashes in testing, the next year he's won the title. So 2007 crashed the McLaren. 08 won the title. 2013 crashed the Mercedes in testing, won the title next year. Now, I hate stats like that because somebody showed me a stat once where if you won the Hungarian Grand Prix, you like won the world championship within the next 3 years. And then Mark Webber won the Hungarian Grand Prix. And I'm like, all right, that's got to be like the word. Like that ain't true. That stat, because he is never winning a world championship. No offense to Mark Webber. But I think that's just clutching at straws there. But it is like, after I saw George Russell, do you remember when he crashed at Imola? At low speed under safety car? I know that was, different conditions in a sense, but after I saw that crash, these crashes can happen. I know this test was not intended to be full speed. That's one thing we have to clarify. It was just sort of a systems check kind of test for Lewis. He was kind of just doing regular laps. So he wasn't on the limit, which is what's being reported. But it could have just been a similar situation. Tires, cold. Something could have happened. He could have been thrown off by one application of the throttle. So stuff like this happens.
There's another little caveat to this as well, that when they do these previous sort of period sort of test cars that they're doing, they're not on like current spec Pirelli tires. They have a special like testing spec of tires coming in. So yeah, he's figuring out a new car. He's going through the systems when they've got a litany of things that they're going on and buttons to try and press and procedures. It's in a fast corner, so I'm pretty sure Lewis would be pushing and trying to find out where the limits are. So mistakes happen. That has been blown all out of proportion. And talking about mistakes, I've made lots of mistakes during this whole podcast, but it's been lovely to have you guys along. I think that's probably a nice, fair point to wrap this up then. So why don't you follow the panel? Jono, where can people follow you?
Yeah, Johnny S8, JONNYESS8, Twitter and Instagram. Can we still call it Twitter? Has it been too long now?
Fine, we call it whatever you want.
I don't know. X, it's like Visa, Cash App, RB. That's Toro Rosso to me. It's never going to change. But you can, catch me on socials there. Definitely give me a follow. I will text about this Luka Doncic trade. Third strike for, I don't know, for the rest of my life. What just happened there? And also I've got a website as well, jonathansimon.com.au. We will put that in the description. So it's easy to access for all of you.
Lovely. And Matt Trumpets, I think you occasionally speak about Bouncy Ball as well. I don't do Bouncy Ball, but where can people follow you?
Always on any socials at MattPT55. Come find me and say hi.
Cool. I would say that I'm the best one to follow me, but I'm not. But you can follow me anyway at KylePowerF1 on Twitter. I'm also on the Facebooks as well, if you happen to be that way inclined. That was a lovely show. Thank you for having us aboard, and thank you for listening to Missed Apex Podcast.